Are you an early stage founder revolutionizing the future of retail? Then you're in the right place. My name is Shah, and I'm an angel investor investing at the pre-seed stage in retail tech, e-commerce, marketplaces, and digitally native brands. I'm also the founder of Retail X Series, an ecosystem to help early stage founders in the retail sector. Retail X Series includes events, a YouTube channel, a Slack community, resources for founders, and this podcast. And in this podcast, I interview founders, investors, and experts in the retail space, and we dig deep into the tactics around key topics that early stage founders want to hear about. Welcome to the Retail X podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Retail X Series podcast. I'm your host, Shah. In today's episode, we'll be talking about how to build a DTC brand for a successful launch. Our guest today, Sara Slywka, is the co-founder of Nestig. Welcome to the podcast, Sara.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have this conversation today. So let's start with talking a little bit more about you and Nestig. Tell us a little bit about your background and what Nestig does.
So Nestig is a direct-to-consumer nursery brand for modern parents. Right now, we sell cribs, but we have plans to be expanding our categories in the next few months. We launched in August of 2020, which already feels like forever ago. And then prior to launching Nestig, I spent around 5 years in e-commerce, most of that at Amazon, and then got my MBA at Columbia, which is where I met my co-founder, Guy.
Great. So let's go back to the very beginning before launch. So you and Guy had been working on the product, supply chain, prototypes. I mean, you have like a physical product that's quite large, so all those basics. How long from when you actually started on the concept for Nestig was it before you actually launched?
I'm trying to remember the exact timeline, but it was at least a year, maybe around 14 months, I think, that we were working on all of the different pieces, including the brand and, refining the product and really feeling like we were ready for launch. I think probably about 14 months.
I mean, that's a lot of prep right before a launch. So in that timeline, you had a ton to do. You had a lot of time to get set for kind of a launch strategy. So let's start with some of the pieces. Let's start with branding. How did you go about branding Nestig? Did you hire an outside firm? What did you do kind of pre-launch to get the brand ready?
So this was a really, really big debate for us on which direction we wanted to go. If we looked at a lot of the consumer brands that we admired and thought had done super well, when you looked at their sort of pre-launch branding trajectory, they went out and raised a bunch of money, they hired Red Antler, and they ended up with this really amazing brand. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out if that was the right path for us. We did not have the resources to go out and hire a Red Antler. So one avenue we were considering was, do we do kind of a launch under like a throwaway brand name where we're testing out just the product. Once we start to see success, we can go out and raise and then hire a big firm. So those were kind of two different paths that we were thinking about. We ended up doing neither of them. I reconnected with a former colleague of mine who does a lot of editorial work, and she had recently partnered with another former colleague who had just graduated from design school as kind of her second career. So she had a really amazing just taste level, design perspective, and we were able to work with them on a project for a super, super low budget because it was, I think, the first project of that particular nature that they had taken on. But I had a lot of confidence in their ability to give us something that was going to really be a brand that we could stick with and not have to do this, fake dummy launch and then, rename, rebrand after raising. And we were super happy with the results we got from them.
And that's really interesting because I think a lot of times, founders go through that same question of like, do we raise now and, hire this very expensive branding firm, or do we kind of do this dummy launch? But you found kind of a third path, which is really interesting. I've also heard other founders use sort of a freelance, somebody who's maybe worked at a big kind of agency and do a little bit of minimal branding work to kind of get to a launch. So I think that branding path is really interesting that you took. So tell me a little bit more about kind of how did you work with that team to really understand what the critical elements of your brand are? Obviously, you're selling things for the nursery, so cribs and things like that. Obviously, your customer is a parent, but how did you take those hypotheses pre-launch about who the customer is and what kind of brand you're looking for and communicate it to that team that was helping you create the branding?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that was most important to me as we were thinking about the brand was thinking about what was missing from the experience when we looked at our competitive set. So we were thinking about being in baby, and a lot of the products out there are just super functionality driven. There's a lot of fear mongering in kind of the baby world where parents feel like if they don't buy the right thing, like bad things are going to happen to their child. And I think observing that, I knew we really wanted to create the opposite experience. We wanted to create a really delightful and fun shopping experience that really reflected the room that the parent was about to create. The nursery is such a fun space, but the experience parents were having was going to Buy Buy Baby, which has, 1 million products. They're feeling super overwhelmed. And so I knew we wanted both a curated product assortment, but then also a brand experience that just like truly captured the delightful elements that the nursery should have. And so that was really important, having a brand that was really playful and fun. I think another problem that we were trying to solve with our branding is that we knew when we launched, we weren't going to have tons and tons of lifestyle photography because it's really expensive to do lifestyle photography for furniture. And so we wanted a brand that had some graphic elements that would allow us to really make the most of the imagery we have. So our kind of final brand included, I think, around 5 or 6 different shapes that we could play around with to create really beautiful backgrounds and just different designs for our pages, allowing us to really stretch our true image assets. And I think, having that need to solve that problem gave us something that we ended up, even now when we have more capacity to create lifestyle images, we just love having those different playful, fun shapes.
That is really interesting, and really thinking ahead to kind of how do you maximize, that whatever you spent for the branding. It's really interesting. I haven't heard founders really talk about that, ways, because I do think those conversations come later, oh, now we need all this lifestyle photography. It's going to cost all this money. I can only do, X and Y and not all the things we want to do. Super interesting to think about planning ahead for that and creating a brand and brand elements that can help solve that problem. Thank you for sharing that. When you were kind of building this brand and you talked about sort of playful and not fear mongering, how did you and your co-founder kind of work together to sort of land on those concepts? Was that with the people who were helping you do branding, or was that kind of the two of you really thinking through what you wanted your brand to be?
I would say it was a combination of both. The team that was helping us with our branding, I think, was really great about asking us those kind of reflective questions of what do you see as your values as a company? And then, on the other side, like, what do you believe about your customer? So on both sides of those, I think there were things that were important to us as founders that we wanted to bring into the brand. So one of kind of the elements of our brand, which isn't as much reflected in the visual identity, but kind of in the language that we use, is made with kindness. So we wanted everything behind the products we make to really reflect that. So from, working with manufacturers that we know and trust, to just how we relate internally with one another and how we communicate with our customers. So that was something that I think was important to us, that our team really helped us kind of bring into just this really kind of nailed down phrase that has a lot of meaning, even though it's like very short and simple. And then some of the other pieces of the brand that they kind of helped us like draw out of our vision, kind of this concept of delight that I was talking about, we kind of hammered it down into the phrase everyday magic. And so thinking about like parenting obviously has a lot of non-magical moments, but there are, every day there's like, something that makes you smile or things like that. So those were kind of two disparate pieces that we wanted to really bring together in the brand. And I think that came both from like, my previous experience in baby and, just like our general vision for the company. And our design team really helped us kind of reflect on those things and bring them out.
That's great. That's really helpful kind of context. As you were thinking about kind of those things and these phrases, the images, there's also this question of sort of pricing and how pricing relates to brand positioning. I'm sure this is a conversation you've had many, many times on kind of where to price your products. How did you think about this kind of pre-launch without really knowing exactly how much consumers are willing to spend or, having your product out there? How did you map that pricing to where your brand values were?
Yeah, this was a really, really big challenge for us. I think we produce in Brazil, and that's more expensive than producing in China. So our costs are higher, and our product truly is premium. But we had a big question mark of like, how much are our customers willing to pay for that? And we debated so much on where we wanted to be. Obviously, you have the constraints around you need a healthy margin based on what your costs are. But we looked around a lot, and I think we knew that our quality was on par with, some of the more luxury brands like a Restoration Hardware, Crate and Barrel. And we wanted to come in a step below them in terms of price and accessibility. And so we kind of, I guess, almost triangulated where we wanted to be. We wanted it to feel more affordable. But feeling more affordable is very subjective. So, some people would be like, oh, it's $100 cheaper. It doesn't feel more affordable. And I think we honestly was a little bit of like throwing a dart, just in terms of like between those two constraints in terms of, is this, giving us enough margin? Is this, kind of as accessible as we want it to be, and just sort of went with it and hoped that it would work. We obviously talked to a lot of merchandisers and people in the specific category that we were in to make sure we were kind of on the ball, and got good feedback from them. But it has been surprising, I think, to me. Like, our product is expensive. It costs $599. To hear from a lot of parents that they actually find it really affordable based on all of the functionality that we're providing. So it was definitely not a sure thing. We were hoping that we were in the right range, and I think that's proven to be true.
I'm so glad that you said that there. What did you say? Something about like kind of throwing a dart in the middle and kind of hoping for the best. I think pricing is one of the hard elements of kind of any early stage business. And I don't think you really know. And I appreciate your honesty in kind of saying like this was a challenge for you, because I do think that most founders are a little bit doing the same thing, right? No matter what the product category is. And I think without a lot of information and having an actual product out there, you don't really know quite yet if that pricing is exactly where you want it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's much easier to go down in price than it is to go up in price, but changing price at all, I think it gets much harder once you're out there. So you're kind of hoping that you get it right on the first try.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay. So let's shift the conversation a little bit to talk about now planning for the launch. So you mentioned that you launched in August of 2020. What kind of launch were you looking to do? What did you end up doing? A soft launch, a big and splashy launch? Kind of what were your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so this was another kind of big debate. And I think in the startup world, there's like the lean startup methodology, and there's all of this kind of advice around like, if you're not embarrassed of your first product, you're not moving fast enough. And I don't really believe that applies in consumer. And especially in our category, we sell baby products. People want to know that, we've done all of our homework, that all of our products have been safety tested, that some reputable source has, done some diligence on them. So for us, it was important to do a big launch to just kind of start building that trust with parents. I think doing like, a soft launch or slow and steady was not a great option for us. And so what a big splashy launch looked like for us was hiring a PR firm. And so they helped us with both kind of getting that initial launch press to help us really build that legitimacy and trust, and also with the big influencer campaign. And unlike other categories, when you're doing something that is targeted at expecting parents, you can't like have everyone receive their product on the same day and have like this big kind of coordinated effort. So our influencer campaign was very much based on like who needed our product at the right time. And so their content kind of started to come out like, I would say around a month before launch. And so that's when we started building interest. So people would see influencer posts, and we started building our organic following on social. And we encouraged people to DM us for pre-orders. We weren't actually like totally doing pre-orders, but anyone who DM'd us, we gave them like a launch day discount. So we were able to start building a little bit of that kind of buzz before launch.
So when you say that you built your kind of organic social, besides the sort of DM for pre-orders, what sorts of things really worked on social from an organic perspective?
Yeah, I would say building an organic following was one of those things that we just assumed was going to be really easy, and actually was much more challenging. Some influencers that we worked with was clear like they weren't that influential. They would post something and we had sent them a product and our product is high price. So like, it wasn't just like sending a beauty item. It was an investment that we made. And for some influencers, they had almost no impact. But the key for us was kind of those few influencers that really did have huge followings, or not even huge followings, but like just a following that really cares about all the stuff that they're doing and really is like looking to them for advice in that specific world. And so I think it was very spiky for us. Like one side was like influencers whose following just was clearly not engaged with them about, their new crib purchase. And then on the other side, we had like 2 or 3 that were crazy that we felt like drove kind of all of our initial sales in our launch week.
And were those influencers the ones that you had come upon on your own, or that the PR firm had helped you find?
It was a combination of both. I'm pretty shameless about asking for introductions, and I think that has really gone a long way for us, both in terms of influencers and then just also in terms of other brand connections. I know I had asked you for an introduction at Monica and Andy, and that has ended up being like a really helpful introduction for us. And we've started working pretty closely with their team.
That's right. Actually, I think this is a really great point, because to give the audience a little context, you and I met when you were fundraising, and I had actually met your co-founder even like a year before that. And even though I didn't invest in your early round, you still reached out, and we still talked about it and made the introduction. And I think that's really important, is to use every piece of your network that you can in these early days, so you don't have to pay an agency, for example, to find you influencers or partnerships and all of that. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because that was a really, really great point, that even investors who maybe didn't invest are still willing to help.
Yeah, I do think that's rare. Pretty much every investor that we talked to that gave us a no, but said like, please let me know if we can ever be helpful. I tried to take up a lot of them on that offer. I think you're uniquely helpful, but definitely always worth a try.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just don't know, right, if they can be of help or not. But yeah, I think that's a really good point of really utilizing your networks in all sorts of ways. So you mentioned that you didn't actually have a formal pre-order or sort of wait list program. So how did you kind of build an email list pre-launch?
To be perfectly honest, I don't think we did. We had on our website that was gated like a place for people to enter their email. But most of the people that I think we had on our email list initially were, people we had met during fundraising, classmates of ours that were not actually expecting. I think Instagram was a lot more important for us than email. Yeah, Instagram with our influencer campaign probably did drive a bit of email, since we were directing people to our website, which is where our email pop-up was. But I think email was not really a big channel for us in terms of launch.
So that's really interesting because I do think that in a lot of cases, building those email lists is sort of the large portion of kind of getting ready for a launch. And it's interesting that you found sort of Instagram to be more of where you were finding success, which I think just goes to show that probably every company is a little bit different on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And you alluded to this before, but you kind of, with mentioning of Monica and Andy, but I know like even in the very early days before you had launched, you were thinking very deeply about partnerships, particularly in this category. How did you go about setting up partnerships? How did you target who you wanted to partner with, and kind of tell us a little bit about that process pre-launch?
Yeah, so we worked really hard, I think, to get connected all across the baby industry. I think the baby industry is uniquely collaborative because, all of these different categories that aren't necessarily competitive with one another are trying to reach the exact same customers in a very short window of time. So we tapped our network to get introduced to a lot of the different, I would say, more of the kind of direct to consumer modern brands. And I think people were really, really generous with us for being kind of this like non-existent company, since most people we got connected with before launch. But I think people really resonated with our product, and there are really not other kind of new modern brands in cribs specifically. And so I think we seemed like a good partner fit for a lot of the different people we met. And Instagram giveaways are really, really big in the baby world. And so I think we did one of our first giveaways with Monica and Andy, and they get really crazy engagement. And they typically do their giveaways where they're collecting email addresses, and then all of the partner brands get access to that list. So even though we didn't have a list when we actually launched, we were able to build our email list pretty rapidly through partnering with other brands on giveaways. And I think that gave us great visibility among our customer base, and then also building that trust of like, oh, like you're partnered with DockATot on this giveaway, and that's a brand that I like really know. And so I think we really benefited from that. And I think that is something that's kind of, I think a lot of categories are doing these kind of like co-marketing giveaways, but I think at baby, the audience is super, super engaged because they're going to have to spend a bunch of money and buy all of those products. So partnerships have been really important for us. And I think, we just happened to talk to a lot of really gracious people that were willing to work with us, even though, we didn't have a lot to offer at that particular moment in time other than, our product.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about the category, which sort of leads me to my next question, sort of the elephant in the room. So you launched Nestig in the middle of a pandemic. I know when we had talked before your launch, you were talking about doing some in real life pop-ups. I mean, people want to see a crib. They want to understand, that trust factor you alluded to before, and you weren't able to do those things, right? So how did kind of launching in the middle of a pandemic affect your launch plans?
Yeah, I think we had a lot of ideas of things that would be really fun to do. And looking back, I'm honestly not sure how much those sorts of ideas would have moved the needle. I think, our sort of new COVID life has opened doors, to things like, obviously like Zooms got really big where you kind of were interacting in the same way that anybody could with somebody that was like really far away. And so I think, some of the in-person things we had planned probably would not have been super impactful for us. But I think one of the effects it did have is we, as a new brand that was digital first, we're really well positioned to sell our products online. We have free shipping and free returns. We have really great customer service. And our website is really designed to tell the story of our product. And then meanwhile, you had some of our competitors that are much more focused around brick and mortar. Their product detail pages were not very inspiring. They weren't as informative as parents wanted them to be. So I think one of the impacts for us was that it helped us really stand out from our competitors. And I think before the pandemic, a lot of people would have said like, oh no, I would never buy a crib that I hadn't seen in person. But then, during COVID, people are not trying to go to stores, especially when they're expecting and really wanting to lower their risk. And so we had to get creative. We've started doing one-on-one Zoom video product tours. And I think like for us, we're still not totally sure like how important that could be to our business. I think we think it has a lot of potential, but we haven't fully kind of like put the muscle behind it to really understand the impact. But if that's something that we feel like is really working for customers, is much more scalable than an in-person retail where you're kind of confined to a specific geographic location. And I think we've also found in our category that the more kind of touch points that we can have with the customer where we can start building that relationship, the more confident they feel in us that we're going to take care of them. And then more likely they are to make a purchase and then be really happy with their purchase.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm so glad you mentioned the one-on-one Zoom video product tours, because I think that being creative has, for particularly a lot of brands during the pandemic and like not having necessarily maybe wholesale or pop-ups or your own stores as an option, and products that, people wanted or historically wanted to try before buying.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting how creative you have to be, and interesting how you're able to take advantage of being digital first versus the competition as well. Great. So we've a little bit talked about this, but I wanted to get a little deeper into kind of your fundraising strategy. So this is always a question, even if you're not hiring a red antler or an expensive agency prior to launch, do you fundraise before launch? Do you fundraise after launch? How did you and your co-founder think through your fundraising, particularly in the middle of a pandemic, pre-launch? How did you decide kind of what you needed to do on fundraising to kind of support a launch, given that there were all these other things going on in the world as well?
Yeah. So I think this is one of those sort of decisions that on some level was made for us. So Guy and I both put money into the company, and I think that was important because each one of us proved both to ourselves and the other one that, we're willing to put our money where our mouth is. This is what we want to do with our careers moving forward. And Guy, my co-founder, has a background in venture capital. And so, raising around pre-launch, I think was like a pretty natural thing for us to plan on. So we started raising, and I think around February, and I think we were in this moment in the world in February where consumer was, not performing for a lot of investors, and they were looking to kind of pare down that part of their portfolio. And we just were not seeing great success in our fundraising. Then COVID happened, and it just did not seem like the right time and the right way for us to be spending our time. And so we had to get super scrappy and think about and I think this is a really great exercise that I would encourage people to do, of think about what would I do if I had, all of the money that I think I need for this company, and kind of make really big plans, and then kind of think on the opposite side of how could I still accomplish this without any of that money. And I think we were able to really make those dollars stretch really far. We ended up raising a small round to kind of give us a little bit of cushion for that launch. And we also have a very capital efficient business because we have a zero inventory model, which I think also was what allowed us to launch without raising a big round. And while, hearing a lot of no's was kind of disheartening for us, after launch, we got such an amazing response from customers that we were starting to fund the company with revenue, which is, the most ideal place to be, and really kind of having that autonomy to set the vision for your company. So it was both a decision that we made, but also a decision that other people made in terms of, whether to say yes or no to us, that kind of led us to our particular plan.
Yeah, I think this is a common theme with early stage founders and you mentioned this, which I think is true, is that there, particularly pre-COVID, there was a sort of softening of interest in DTC brands from investors. Mm-hmm. And it was harder to make that pitch. So, and it kind of still is. So I think that's a really helpful perspective as D2C founders who are listening to this podcast start thinking through how they're going to raise money and how they're going to launch with many times not the ability to go raise a couple $1,000,000 before you actually have a product and revenue. So thanks for sharing that. I want to end on advice. So you've told us all about kind of like the process that you went through with Nestig and all these decisions that were made and that you had to make. But what's the one piece of advice you would give to founders who are kind of getting ready to launch their brands? You know, what's the one thing you would say is the most important for them to keep in mind?
This is a very hard question. I think I both feel like very ill qualified to give advice, but then I also feel like I have like so many different things that I would share. I would say one is I would really think about what your business model edge could be, whether it's having some sort of special relationship with your manufacturer. I think in direct to consumer, beyond just having a great brand, I think you also really want something operationally that's going to set your business apart and set you up for success. And then the other piece I think is just like trust yourself. I think we went through a lot in the branding process where we felt like, somebody else who worked at Red Antler knew a lot better than we did about like what our brand should be like. And I think, when we started really actually trusting our instincts, we were able to get a product that we like still feel really great about and we feel like really is unique and true to us as founders and our customer.
I think both of those pieces of advice are fantastic. And I love that we're ending on kind of trust yourself. You're a founder, you're doing this for a reason. You know what that reason is. I think trusting yourself is just a lovely way to end this. So, Sara, thank you so much for sharing kind of your story and your advice on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to the Retail X podcast. We'll have another episode out shortly. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to attend a Retail X Series event, check out www.retailxseries.com for upcoming virtual events and recordings of past events. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Retail X Series. You can also learn more about me, find fundraising resources, or submit a pitch deck at www.redgiraffeadvisors.com. Thanks, and catch you next time.